here at the brand new NRA National Sporting Arms Firearms Museum here at Bass Pro World Headquarters in Springfield, Missouri with Jim Supica. Jim, you are just uber director of the museums now. So we did an overview here for Curator's Corner, the last couple segments. So now I want to get into each of these 5 cases. This is the 1350 to 1700 ancient firearms case. So we're going down the timeline. Tell us what we're going to find in here.
We're starting down the timeline of sporting arms in America. And as you come into the museum, there's initial information on NRA. That's who we are. And the centerpiece of this exhibit is a wonderful artifact that arrived just 2 weeks before opening. We're incredibly grateful to be able to exhibit it. But it's Alexander Hamilton's Powderhorn, the Powderhorn of one of our founding fathers. An incredibly rare to have an authentic piece from one of those immortal individuals, and very, very proud to be able to display it there.
Unbelievable.
But before we had the founding fathers, America was an unknown continent, and the earliest firearms were brought to America from Europe with the early explorers, the conquistadors, the very early colonists and settlers, and that's what we're telling the story of in this first case here. And also it tells the story of very early firearms evolution. So we're starting at the very top with one of the most primitive forms of firearms. It's the matchlock. It's very, very simple. It's basically a tube filled with gunpowder with projectiles loaded in front of it. And then those jaws hold a piece of rope that is treated with chemicals to be able to smolder.
Old school.
Old school. It's like lighting fireworks on the 4th of July with a punk. It's the same principle. When you press that lever on the bottom, that serpentine lowers that smoldering rope into a little pan of gunpowder. Hopefully, if it's not too wet and if it's not too windy and if everything works, that will ignite the pan and that will fire the charge. The right below it is a gun that is as complicated as the one above it is simple. It's the wheel lock, and this is only about 50 years later. This is about 1650 this was introduced. But you see that big crank on the handle?
Yes.
That turns, you
like
turn that by hand, and you wind a spring in there. Now, it took somebody with the skill of a watchmaker, a clockmaker, the very best artisans, the very most skilled engineers of that era to build this. Wind that wheel is held under pressure. It's a wheel with a serrated edge. And then a piece of pyrite or flint is held in the jaws of the cock there. It's lowered onto the edge of the wheel. Then when you pull the trigger, releases that spring, that wheel spins like crazy. You got that serrated edge running against a piece of flint. You make the shower of sparks to ignite the gunpowder charge. What's that sound like to you?
Sparkler?
Bic lighter. It's the same principle as a cigarette lighter. You're spinning the wheel against the flint. That's what that basically was.
Oh,
very
man.
complicated. Really almost too complicated to be used as a commoner's or
right.
a military arm. Most of these were made for royalty or very affluent individuals. Well, they came up with a refinement of the flint against steel with the Michelet lock. This was developed not very much later, but it is the first of the flintlock systems, this and the snap-haunts, where a piece of flint is striking against the frizzen to create the sparks. And the Michelet, the earlier form, has the main spring and a lot of the lock work on the outside of the lock. Really the only difference between that and the traditional flintlock that came to be the dominant form of firearms ignition for a few centuries is that most of the mechanics are on the inside underneath the lock plate of the flintlock.
So the flintlock, that's part of the firearms evolution. A lot of people have heard of that as far as in the timeline.
Yeah, that's kind of where a lot of people pick up with firearms evolution. You think of the oldest gun you can, you think of the flintlock, and it worked well. It was a dominant form of firearms ignition for centuries, worked very well, and that's what we think of when we think of the earliest muzzleloaders. But there were other guns before that.
Right, and the last gun on sort of in this part of the case is pretty impressive looking, Jim. Tell us about that.
It's a massive gun, and this was part of the Remington factory collection that has been loaned to this museum, very significant collection. This was given to a Remington delegation that was traveling to Thailand to try to improve their trade relationships. And this is a wall gun. This would be fired from a wall. It is that Michelet type of action. As you can see, it's gold inlaid, very ornate. This could have been a military arm for a wall, or almost a ceremonial gun based on the level of decoration. But massive. We really had to engineer a support for this gun.
It's got
to set up the museum.
It's got a unique looking support system.
Yeah, we had to hold this one. But it was given to the Remington delegation. This one is, although the system is very old, the gun itself is not as old as you might see. It's about 1860, 1870. The earlier firearms ignition system lasted longer in Asia in use than they did in Europe and the Western Hemisphere.
All right, that's just the first part of the cases going down here in the timeline, 1315 to 1700. That's it for Curator's Corner for this week on Sportsman. We'll be back with more here from the NRA National Sporting Arms Museum at Bass Pro in Springfield, Missouri. Back next week. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, John.